Today, let's master half square triangles while making a version of the bear paw block. Welcome back to Pattern Poole TV. This is month 4 of our 2024 Mystery Quilt Time to Bloom. This is a skill building course where every month we introduce you to a new technique. In month 1 we mastered the perfect 1/4 inch seam allowance and discussed the scant 1/4 inch seam allowance, an essential technique for making accurate patchwork blocks. In month 2 we moved on to using rectangles while making the quarter log cabin block. Month 3 we introduced pointy blocks by learning all about stitch and flip corners, and today, month 4, we are going to make another pointy block, which is a variation on the bear paw block, while learning to master half square triangles, a technique that is used in many patchwork blocks. If this is your first time working with triangles, don't stress too much if you lose a point. When the quilt's washed, it's going to become soft and crinkly, and there's so much to look at that no one's going to miss a bit of a missing point. So take your time and enjoy the process. This course also has a free applique block designed by Monica Poole with the theme of Time to Bloom. This month's block is once again some beautiful flowers blowing in the breeze with a gorgeous butterfly. Our course videos are free for everyone to watch and enjoy on YouTube, and if you'd like to make this quilt, you can sign up and purchase the course on our website. I'll put a link in the description. So here are all the pieces cut out, ready to sew. The cutting instructions are in the course notes, so let's get started. Take the 3-inch background squares and place them on your cutting mat with the wrong side facing up. Mark a diagonal line from corner to corner onto the wrong side of each background square. A tip is to use a nice sharp marker to mark the line because a fine line is going to be more accurate than a thick line. I'm using my Sew Line Trio pen with the grey coloured lead. Now take the 3-inch medium rectangles and place them on your cutting mat with the right side facing up. Place the background squares on top so that the right sides are facing. I'm now going to place the squares on my ruler so that I can easily take them over to my sewing machine. This just helps to keep all the pieces together. And now it's time to thread your machine up. Thread your machine with a neutral coloured thread, a size 70 needle and your 1/4 inch foot. Also shorten your stitch length to a length of 2. Now this entire block is made with a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance, so make those extra little adjustments as we showed in the part 1 video. And if you're new here and you missed that video, we'll put a link in the description for you. So start with a leader and then sew onto a square, sewing a 1/4 inch away from the marked line. Use the edge of your foot as a guide to make sure that your stitching is going to be nice and accurate. And then just sew from piece to piece, chaining in between each piece. So we're going to sew down the left side of the marked line on all of the squares. And don't cut them apart because we're just going to turn around and then continue sewing along the other side of the marked line. And don't forget to finish with an ender. So take all your pieces to the cutting mat. This is what they should look like. Then grab your rotary cutter and cut each piece on the marked line. Now it's time to press the pieces. So head to your ironing mat and press the pieces towards the darkest colour with the 3-step pressing technique. That's where you set the seam, Then you open out the seam and finger press, and then press the seam again with the iron. Doing this will ensure that no tiny creases are pressed into the seams. So now it's time to trim each piece to 2.5 inches square. I'm going to do this with a 6.5 inch square ruler, and the instructions I'm about to give are for a right-handed person, so if you're left-handed, just put it in reverse. So first of all, take your ruler and position the 0 corner at the top right-hand side of the block. Now the really important thing is to make sure that you take that 45-degree line of the ruler and you line it up with the 45-degree seam on our half square triangles. First of all, just make sure that you have plenty of space. So locate the 2.5 inch line, and you can see that we do have plenty of space to do that. Now just slide the ruler down so that you're going to trim an even amount away from each edge of the square, making sure that diagonal line is in the right place. Once you've got that positioned, we're now going to trim up the side and across the top edge. Now rotate the block so that the trimmed edges are now on the left side and on the bottom edge. Take your ruler and position the 2.5 inch line on those trimmed edges, making sure your diagonal line is in the right place. And once again, just trim up the side and across the top edge. And here's our nice, neat 2.5 inch half square triangle. A little bit of a tip is to get some sticky sandpaper dots to put on the bottom of your ruler, and that will stop your ruler from slipping around when you're trying to cut. Go ahead and do the same to the others, and you should now have 16 half square triangles. So set these triangles aside while we go ahead with making the rest of the block. Now take the 2.5 inch light and dark squares and sew them together with a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance, starting with the leader, chaining from piece to piece and finishing with an ender. You know the drill. Once you're done, head to the ironing board to press the seam towards the darkest fabric with the 3-step pressing technique. Now position these pieces on your cutting mat with the dark square at the top edge, and take a 4.5 by 2.5 inch dark rectangle, and we're going to sew that onto the right side edge of each of these pieces, just in the usual way again, chaining from piece to piece and pressing the seam towards the darkest fabric. Now you know that your seam allowance is correct if the two joined pieces are the same size as the rectangle. Now for the fun part, let's lay out the block. So those triangles can be tricky to place, so just keep spinning them until each quarter of the block it looks like they're bear claws. Now to sew them together, I think the best way to do this is to sew each bear paw separately. So take the top 2 triangles and place them right sides together, then pin them on the edge to be sewn. This is really important so that you don't accidentally sew the wrong edge. Then take the next 2 triangles, once again place them right sides together and pin them on the edge to be sewn. It's a good idea to open them out and make sure that they're pinned correctly before you even start sewing them. Now head to the machine, once again starting with the leader and sewing our first set of triangles together. When sewing triangles, it's really important to keep that seam allowance consistent. I think especially as you get to the end, because it can be easy to kind of sew off on an angle. I've actually done this before myself, but making sure that that 1/4 inch seam allowance stays the same. It is actually that scant 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way from the top to the bottom. When you go to sew the second one, instead of sewing from the bulky end, it's okay to turn it over so that you'll be sewing from the non-bulky end. Just, you know, make sure that you are sewing on the correct side of the triangle, because it is easy to turn them in the wrong direction. So I think just taking our time and making sure that we're sewing everything the right way is really important. It will reduce the amount of unpicking that you might have to do, which is okay. We all have to unpick sometimes. Now to press them, press towards the darkest fabric again, really making sure that we've got that seam pressed correctly with the 3-step pressing technique. And you can see there the seam going towards the triangle. You will have a little bit of bulk at one end, but that's not too bad and we can easily sew that into the seam. And place it back into the block again. And now separate the block into 2 rows and let's sew those pieces together to make the rows. And a little tip is I use my trusty tailor's awl. You can also use a wooden skewer with a point on it to help hold those seams flat as you sew under your foot. So now it's time to press, and we're going to press the seam of the larger section towards the darkest fabric, but we're going to break our rule. When we press our smaller section, we're going to actually press towards the lighter fabric, and the reason for this is that it's much more important to have those seams facing in opposite directions so that they nest and reduce the bulk when we sew that final seam. So now it's time to sew the 2 rows together, and you'll see that the seams are all facing in opposite directions. So when this happens, it means that the seams are nesting. So that means that we're not going to have a thick, bulky seam, and it's easier to align the seams. So I'm going to align the seams using glue basting. You can also use the pin trick as shown in the first video, but I love glue basting because I find that it's just so accurate. So to do this, I use my ruler and I just pop that on top of my ironing mat to protect my ironing mat from any glue, and I just put dabs of glue within the seam allowance. I then align the 2 pieces, making sure those seams are nice and lined up. I'll then just give it another final press to make sure that the glue is dry before sewing the seam. So now it's time to sew that final seam. Don't forget to use your tailor's awl to hold those seams nice and flat as you sew. Then press that seam with the 3-step pressing technique. You know the drill. Open it out and you'll see 1 bear paw unit. And there you have it, 1 finished bear paw unit. So you'll know you're on the right track if your points finish a 1/4 inch away from the raw edge. So go ahead and make the other bear paw units in the same way. Then lay your block out and join it together. You know how to do this. We've done this before and I'm confident that you can do this just in the same way that we have done in the previous months. Once you've done that, sew on the borders and then layer it together with the batting and backing and quilt the block. And here's my block, all finished and quilted. We're not doing the extended video showing how to do the quilting this time because it's pretty much quilted just in the same way as our tulip block. So we've continued on with the kind of like arrow shaped quilting. That's what Alora likes to call that. And as I said, just quilted in the same way. But if you did want to come up with another way to quilt the block, you can definitely do that. You just have to make sure that you don't quilt past the border seam. And these are all the blocks coming together. I think it's looking absolutely beautiful. It was Alora's idea to do a monochromatic quilt. And then as we started going, she wasn't really sure about the blues. And the other day she was sitting in my sewing studio and she said, wow, this is really becoming a magical quilt. And it really is actually, it's quite gorgeous. So we're so proud of all the work that everybody has done on our Facebook group. People are sharing photos of their work, so you can check them out on Facebook. Feel free to join our Pattern Poole community Facebook group. And just beautiful colours, like everybody's coming up with their own colours. There's lots of people doing blues like us. Some people are using their stash. We've got variations of blue and green. We've got pinks and reds, there's golds. Like, it's just absolutely amazing to see everybody making a quilt and making it, you know, in their colours. Some people are changing up some of the blocks a little bit. We had a few people that didn't like snails, so they've like swapped it out with a bird or a butterfly. We just love giving everyone the ideas and helping you to be, you know, your best creative self. So we're just here to inspire the creativity, but it's all about making the quilt that you want to make. So thanks for watching, and we will see you in part 5. I can't believe we're up to part 5 already.